In section 8.6, we'll be doing even more factoring. It'll be a lot like the last section where we were factoring trinomials, except in this section, you'll notice that our trinomials have a number in front of the x squared term. That was not the case in section 8.5. And having a number in front of your x squared term throws a huge curveball into our whole process. And the best way to figure out how to do it is just by looking at examples. So here's example number 1, factor the trinomial. So we have 2x squared minus 11x plus 5. So last time we just had to figure out what numbers multiply to give me this term that add up to give me the middle term. In this section, we have to figure out what combination of the first number and the last number will give me the middle number. And until you get the hang of this, I suggest setting up a first and last chart. So your first and last chart will look something like this, and we'll come back to this after I explain how we're going to set up our parentheses. So remember, a trinomial like this is going to break down into the product or the multiplication of two binomials. So remember, binomials means two terms. So we know that when we take the first number here times the first number here, I need to get 2x squared. And when I take the last number here times the last number here, I'll need to get the positive 5. However, it'll be when I take this first number times this last number and this last number times this first number, that combination is how I get the middle number. And so that's where the first and last chart comes into play. So we need to figure out what factors of 2 combined with what factors of 5 when I take this first number times this last number and this last number times this first number, what combination of those factors will give me negative 11 in the middle. And this problem actually is a little bit easier for us since 2 is prime and 5 is prime, so we have so many numbers to work with. 1 times 2 is 2, so I know that I have to take 1 times 2 in order to get that 2 of the 2x squared back out. I also know that when I take this last number times this last number, I got to get 5, and there's only one way to get 5, that would be 1 times 5. So now it's up to me to decide, am I going to take 1 times 1 and 2 times 5 to get that middle term, or am I going to take the 1 times the 5 and the 2 times the 1 in order to get that 11 in the middle? Because again, it's this first number times this last number, and this last number times this first number is the way that I get that middle term. So if I take 1 times 5, I get 5. And if I get 2 times 1, I get 2. But if I add those two together, I get 7. I need to get 11 in the middle. So let's flip it back around. If I take 1 times the 1 and 2 times the 5, 1 times 1 is 1 and 2 times 5 is 10. So when I add those together, I end up getting 11. But remember, I need to get negative 11. And thinking back to the last section, it's only numbers that go here and here, like in the last two blanks, that I can make negative. So I could make the 1 negative and the 5 negative so that I would get 1 times negative 1 is negative 1 and 2 times negative 5 is negative 10, and then I would get negative 11 in the middle. So it's only the last term factors that you can make negative. So again, only the last term's factors can be made negative if necessary to produce the correct sign for your middle term. So now it's just a matter of placement. We know that when I take the first number times the first number, I need to get at least the x squared. So I know that I have to have an x here and an x here. And now we figured out that I need to put a 1 in front of this x and a 2 in front of this x, so that when I take 1x times 2x, I'm going to get the 2x squared. And then using my first and last chart, I figured out that I need to take 1 times negative 1 to get the negative 1 over here. So I'm going to put minus 1 right here. And then I also figured out my first and last chart that I need to take 2 times negative 5. So if I put the 2 here, then I'm going to put the negative 5 or the minus 5 here. Because again, it's the first times the last and the last times the first that produces that middle term. So if you multiply it all back out, 1x times 2x is 2x squared. 1x times negative 1 is negative 1x. Negative 5 times 2x is negative 10x, and negative 5 times negative 1 is positive 5. So then when I combine like terms, these two terms in the middle, I would get 2x squared minus 11x plus 5, just like I got when I started. So again, using this first and last chart will always help you set up what factors you need to use to get that middle term. And again, this will be something that just practice makes perfect. The more you do it, the better you're going to get at it, the easier you're going to see what factors to use of your first and last number to produce your middle term. So let's look at some more examples. So here's example number 2, factor the trinomial, 3x squared minus 5x plus 2. So again, notice that we do have a number in front of your x squared term. So we got to set up our parentheses first. And we know that we're going to have a binomial, so 2 terms over here times a binomial, 2 terms over here. And I'm also going to set up my first and last chart. So just like before, I need to figure out what factors of 3 and what factors of 2 can I combine so I get negative 5 in the middle. And just like before, this problem is going to be a little bit easier for us since 3 and 2 are both prime. So we only have so many factors to deal with since there's only 2 factors for 3 and 2 factors for 2. So that being said, let's get to it. So the only 2 factors of 3 are 1 and 3. So now we just need to figure out, since the factors of 2 are 1 and 2, am I going to take 1 times 1 and 3 times 2? Or am I going to take 1 times 2 and 3 times 1? So just some intuition here, I recognize that if I put a 2 here and a 1 here, because again, 1 times 3 is 3, 2 times 1 is 2, and if I multiply, 1 times 2 is 2, 3 times 1 is 3, and if I add those together, I get 5. But remember, I need to get a negative 5, and it's only numbers from the last term that I can make negative. So if I make this number negative, then that would make that negative. 1 times negative 2 is negative 2. And if I make this number negative, that makes the 3 negative, and then negative 2 plus negative 3 is negative 5. So I know that I'm going to have minus signs in both of my parentheses. It's going to be like a minus 2 and a minus 1. So now we just have to place it. Again, I know that I'm going to have an x here and an x here, so that when I take the first number times the first number, I get that 3x squared. And again, it doesn't matter where you start, we just need to start placing things. So I know that I need to have a 1 and a 3, either a 1 here and a 3 here, or a 3 here and a 1 here. And it doesn't matter where you start, you just got to start somewhere. So I'm just going to put the 1 here and the 3 here. I could have just as easily put the 3 here and the 1 here. It doesn't matter. So remember, it's the first term times the last term and the last term times the first term that produces that middle term. So in my first and last chart, I recognize that I needed to take 1 times negative 2. So I'm going to put a minus 2 right here. And then I needed to take the 3 times the negative 1. So 3 times negative 1, I'm going to put minus 1 here. So my final answer would be x minus 1, since I really don't need to have that 1 there, times 3x minus 2. And again, you can always check your answer by multiplying it back out and see if you get what you started with. And here's example number 3, factor the trinomial. So notice this one's a little bit different. We have a negative sign in front of our x squared term. The first number cannot be negative. So if your first number is negative, you always need to factor a negative 1 from each term of your trinomial, which if I take a negative 1 out, that just means that everything becomes its opposite. So I'm going to put negative 1 times 4x squared. That plus 4x would become a minus 4x, and that plus 3 would become a minus 3. So now this negative 1 is just going to hang out here by itself, and I'm just going to focus on factoring this trinomial, this new trinomial, down to 2 binomials. So again, that negative 1 is just going to hang out here, and I'm going to set up my 2 parentheses. I know it's going to be a binomial, so 2 terms here, times another binomial, 2 terms here. I'm going to set up my first and last chart. And this problem is going to be a little bit tougher since notice that 4 is not prime. We actually have 2 sets of factors that produce 4, 1 times 4 and 2 times 2. But the 3 still only has 2 factors, 1 and 3. I also want you to notice that the last number is negative. Remember, when I take the last number here times the last number here, when I multiply these 2 together, I get that last term. So in order to get a negative number, one of these has to be positive and one of them has to be negative. So make sure you jot that down in your notes, that when the last term is negative, remember that one of the factors has to be positive and one of them has to be negative. So with that being said, let's get into it. So we know it has to be 1 times 3. So I can fill in that part of my first and last chart. But now I need to decide, am I going to use the 1 times the 4 or the 2 times the 2 to produce that 4 for our first term. So it's just a matter of guessing and checking until you get better at this. So if I put the 1 here and the 4 here, and remember, one of these numbers has to be negative. If I do 1 times 1, I get 1, and 4 times 3 is 12. Even if I made one of these numbers negative, I still would not get the 4 in the middle like I want. So let's see what happens if I flip that around. Let's put the 4 here and the 1 here. 4 times 1 is 4, and 1 times 3 is 3. And remember, one of these numbers has to be negative. But even if I made one of them negative, I still would not get that negative 4 that I want in the middle. So let's try our next option. The only other option I have for the factors of 4 are 2 and 2. So we're going to put a 2 here and a 2 here. So let's multiply across. 2 times 1 is 2, and 2 times 3 is 6. And once again, remember, one of these numbers has to be negative since our last number was negative. So if I made one of these numbers negative, how would I get a negative 4 when I add downwards? If I made the 6 negative, 2 plus negative 6 is negative 4. So if I want to make the 6 negative, that means I want the 3 to be negative. So now that we figured out what combination numbers we need, now it's just a matter of placement. I need to put the 2 in one of the first blanks so that I get the 2 times 2 to get the 4x squared. So I'm going to put 2 here, so it'll be 2x. I want to take 2 times 1. So remember, you go to the opposite parenthesis, and we want that 1 to be positive. Move on to the next term. We want to take 2 times negative 3. So that would have to go here, and then I go to the opposite parenthesis and put that minus 3 like we need. So our final answer would be negative 1 times 2x minus 3 times 2x plus 1. And now on to example number 4. The instructions for these problems is just to simply solve. So not only are we going to be breaking them down into products, but we're also going to use the zero product property in order to actually solve for x. So we have in our first problem 2x squared plus x minus 21 equals 0. So we have a number in front of our x squared term. So what we got to do is set up our two parentheses and think about our numbers that are going to go inside of it. Our last number is negative, so we know that I'm going to take a binomial times a binomial, and the numbers that go here, one of them has to be positive and one of them has to be negative in order to get that negative 21 out in the end. So let's set up our first and last chart, and again, keep in mind that one of the last factors for negative 21 has to be negative. So what combination of 2 and 21 is going to give me that positive 1 in the middle? So the nice thing is that 2 only has 2 factors, 1 and 2. So now we just need to figure out what factors of 21 will combine to give me the 1 in the middle. So the factors of 21 would be 1 and 21, and 3 and 7. Since 21 seems kind of like a pretty big number, if I just need to get a 1 in the middle, I'm going to concentrate on using that 3 and 7. So am I going to do 3 up here and 7 down here, or am I going to flip them around? So let's see what happens. 1 times 3 is 3. 2 times 7 is 14. And remember, one of these numbers has to be negative. But even if I made one of them negative, if I added downwards, there's no way I would get a 1 in the middle. So let's try our next option. Let's do the 7 up here and the 3 down here. So 1 times 7 is 7, 2 times 3 is 6. And once again, remember, one of these numbers is negative. So what number would I make negative in order for me to add downwards and get that positive 1 that I want in the middle? So it would have to be the 6 that's negative, which means the 3 would have to be negative in our parentheses. So now it's just a matter of placing our numbers. So we want to take 1 times 7. So if I put the 1x right here, I go to the opposite parenthesis and I want to put that plus 7, because remember, I want the 7 to be positive. Next, I'm going to take 2 times negative 3. So the 2 would have to go here. It'd have to be 2x so that I get that x times x to get the x squared. And I want to take 2 times negative 3. So now that I have my parentheses all set up, I'm just going to have to set them equal to 0 and solve for x. So my first one, I really don't need to have this 1 here. So it would just be x minus 3 equals 0. And my second one would be 2x plus 7 equals 0. So my first answer is 3, and my second answer, I would subtract the 7 and divide by 2, so I would just get, and keep it as an improper fraction, negative 7 over 2. So my answer would be 3 and negative 7 over 2. Moving on to part B, we have negative 2x squared minus 11x minus 5 equals 0. So here again, we have a negative number in front of our squared term. Whenever your first number is negative, you must factor it out. So our first step before we do anything is to take that negative 1 out. So I'm going to take negative 1, which remember, like we said before, just changes everything in your trinomial to its opposite. So instead of minus 11x, we got plus 11x, and instead of minus 5, we have plus 5. Again, it said equal to 0, so now we need to break this trinomial down into a product of two binomials so that we can use the zero product property. So let's set up our first and last chart since we have a number in front of our first x squared term. So we have a 2 and a 5. So what combination of factors of 2 and 5 will give me 11 in the middle? So again, we kind of lucked out here since 2 only has two factors, 1 and 2, and we're extra lucky in this problem since 5 only has two factors. So let's use a little bit of logic here. Since 2 times 5 is 10, that gets us really close to that 11. So when I'm looking at the factors here, I'm going to put the 1 here and the 5 here because again, when I take 2 times 5, that gets us really close to that 11. So 1 times 1 is 1. 2 times 5 is 10, and since we had a positive here, we don't have to worry about any of these numbers being negative, so 1 plus 10 is 11, which is that number that we wanted in the middle. So we want to take 1 times 1 and 2 times 5, so we set up our two parentheses. I want to take, again, 1 times 1, so I'd have like my 1x right here. I go to the opposite parenthesis and put that plus 1. And then I want to take 2 times 5. So I'm going to do 2x in my second parenthesis, and I go to the opposite parenthesis and put that plus 5. So my answer before I actually solve these would be x plus 5 times 2x plus 1 equals 0. So now, remember, I don't really need to have this 1 here, so my two parentheses would be x plus 5 equals 0, and 2x plus 1 equals 0. So my first answer is negative 5. My second answer, I would subtract 1 and divide by 2. So my second answer would be negative 1/2. So my two answers are negative 5 and negative 1/2. And this is where we're going to end this section. I realize this is a very hard section, and it's literally going to be a practice makes perfect situation. So just know that we're going to be doing lots and lots of practice over lots and lots of days until we all get very, very good at this process. But as always, if there was anything specific you didn't understand, jot it down so you can ask me about it in class, and we'll see you then.